71st Street is the historic heart of South Shore. Since the 1800s, this corridor has been the neighborhood's entryway from the east and west and its main street. The Illinois Central Railroad that runs down the middle of the street carried some of the community's first non-native residents in the mid-19th century, connected South Shore to the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Jackson Park, and continues to carry residents to and from downtown Chicago today. The businesses and housing that clustered along these train tracks have been the cradle of South Shore's development for over 125 years. Today, new plans for 71st Street means this corridor will continue to generate a positive future for our community. The settlement of the neighborhood by non-native residents date back to about 1850. But it wasn't until the 1800s and 1890s that residential developments began to spring up along the train tracks. Coinciding with South Shore's annexation to the city of Chicago in 1889 and the World Columbian Exposition in Jackson Park in 1893. Most of the buildings that still exist today on 71st Street and throughout South Shore date to years 1900 through 1940. During these decades, and especially 1920s, South Shore experienced an explosive population and building boom. The year 1905 saw the establishment of both the Jackson Park Highlands residential development north of 71st Street and the South Shore Country Club on the street's eastern end. Throughout the 1910s, scores of apartment buildings went up in the area north of 71st Street between Jeffrey and South Shore Drive. A 1915 headline in the Tribune declared, "Home seekers flock to sites on South Shore. Region once shunned becomes section of substantial residences." The neighborhood experienced record-breaking real estate prices, and there were stories of developers and even speculators able to triple, quadruple, or even quintuple their money in just a couple of years. In the 1920 census, South Shore's population was 31,832. By 1930, it had more than doubled to 78,755. Much of this increase was due to the appeal of the bungalows, high-rises, and six flats feverishly being built in the neighborhood throughout the 1920s, as well as improvements to Lakeshore Drive and along the lakefront. The commercial corridor on 71st Street expanded to serve the needs of all of the neighborhood's new residents. The Bryn Mawr train stop at 71st and Jeffrey was the first one constructed in the neighborhood in 1881 and has remained a focal point for the neighborhood ever since. The notable historic buildings still clustered around it are evidence of the intersection's role as South Shore's commercial center. In the early 1920s, the 1,850-seat Jeffrey Theater was constructed as part of a block-length mixed-use development at the center of what was then a bustling entertainment district. Although the theater building has been heavily altered, much of its original decorative terracotta facade remains today, including a pair of harp-playing angels. Across the street are a cluster of high-rise, mixed-use apartment buildings, also constructed in the boom years of the late 1920s. The Gothic Revival Building on the southwest corner, built in 1929, the Renaissance Revival Courtyard Building at 1966 East 71st Place, built in 1928. And the glamorous Art Deco Jeffrey Terrace Apartments at 7130 South Jeffrey, built in 1929. These buildings and three more make up the Jeffrey Surreal District, listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1985 for its importance as a catalog of 1920s apartment building architectural styles. Over the course of its history, Like many neighborhoods in Chicago, South Shore's population has cycled through different racial and cultural identities. Beginning with a mix of Swedish and English Protestants and Irish Catholics in the first decades of the 20th century, the neighborhood's makeup became increasingly Catholic and Jewish from the 1930s through the 1960s, before becoming majority African American, beginning in the 1970s. The Hamilton Building on the northwest corner of 71st and Paxton is a good example of how buildings in South Shore have survived and evolved with the neighborhood's history. Originally built in 1916 as part of the area's entertainment district with an elaborate 1,000-seat theater, the building was renovated in 1936 by the young architect William Perriera, who would go on to design the Transamerica Pyramid in San Francisco in 1972. And in the mid-1990s, the storefront at 2154 East 71st would become the first campaign office of one of the South Side's most influential figures, a young Barack Obama. All along 71st Street, you can still see well-preserved and high-quality examples of many of the styles that define Chicago architecture. Classical Revival, in particular, is popular, perhaps inspired by the White City buildings of the 1893 Columbian Exposition in nearby Jackson Park. Examples include the Bryn Mawr State Bank building from 1923, which is still standing today. And this building on the corner of 71st and Bennett, which has its construction date of 1925 proudly displayed on a terracotta shield on the corner. This fantastical Renaissance Revival building between Crandon and Oglesby on the south side of the street was designed by Charles Draper Faulkner in the late 1920s. Faulkner was well known around the South Side, in particular for his design of the Church of Christ Scientist at 72nd and Coles, and several homes in the Jackson Park Highlands. Faulkner's building on 71st features brightly colored terracotta decoration all over, electric lights running along its eave, and a clay tile roof. It's easy to imagine what a splash it must have made in South Shore when it was first constructed. Much has changed on 71st Street since the first trains rumbled down the street from Jackson Park, but much has stayed the same. Generation after generation, families still come to this neighborhood here on Southern Lakefront to raise their families and build their businesses. The people and places of historic 71st Street tell us about South Shore's past as we look forward to its future.